Thanks very much, Julie, and thanks very much to Horse SA for hosting this webinar. My name's Dr. Portland Jones, and this webinar is about introducing equitation science. It's based largely on the book Horses Hate Surprise Parties, which I co-wrote with Sophie Warren. So about me, I teach equitation science at university, and I run a training and coaching facility in Western Australia's Swan Valley. I'm also an author, and I've been an equitation science practitioner for about 18 years. This presentation can be downloaded from the Sustainable Equitation website for those of you who teach Pony Club or teach adult riders. In the presentation you'll find that there are classroom activities and different things that you can do with your students. And a web address for Sustainable Equitation will be on the last slide of the presentation. So, what is equitation science? Equitation science aims to objectively examine the interactions of horses and people, or as we like to say, to look at them with their scientific goggles on, as a way of making life better for the horse. No one owns equitation science. It's not a theory or a method. It doesn't belong to anyone. It's not one person's. It's actually a scientific discipline that emerged about 15 years ago. It uses evidence-based training principles, which are things that have been proven to work. So stuff like negative reinforcement and habituation, these things have been shown to work in scientific situations, proven under controllable and replicable situations. It means that equitation science rejects methods that are used because, you know, this is the way it's always been done. Because it's time, we believe, those of us who use equitation science, to use a more evidence-based training methods for horses. The one great contribution that equitation science has made is to show that there is a very clear link between the use of evidence-based training and improved rider safety and horse welfare, which means that equitation science is really like a superhero for horses, because it really can help us train and manage our horses in the best way possible. So good science is just like a pair of goggles that only lets us see the truth. And so we should really put our scientific goggles on when we work with horses, which is really difficult because the horse has been around for over 55 million years and has lived with us for about 6,000 years. And that's about the same as 3 days in a 75-year lifespan. So he's really much better at being a horse than he is at being a dressage horse or a pony club horse or any of those things. And because the horse has been domesticated for 6,000 years, he's become an incredibly important part of human society. And human history would be completely different if it wasn't for the horse. And so it's very difficult for us to look at him objectively. And that's why equitation science can really help us to get to the crux of what it is about horses that makes the relationship between horses and humans so often problematic. As equitation scientists, we truly believe that anthropomorphism is at the heart of most of the problems that we have between horses and humans. And anthropomorphism is a really big, long word that just basically means that you believe that horses and other animals have human characteristics. So because we suffer from emotional states like jealousy, envy and spite, it's really easy to believe that the horse does too. So people can be vain and we can be proud and deceitful, but a close examination of the horse's brain suggests that he doesn't have the capability for those states. His brain is completely different from ours. It's different, not worse, just different. That's because his evolution as a grazing, herbivorous prey animal is completely different from our evolution as an omnivorous predator. And so evolution, as you know, is the process of gradual change occurring over, you know, thousands and thousands of years that makes each animal uniquely adapted for his evolutionary niche. And so because of the horse's completely different evolution to ours, his brain is completely different to ours. And one of the best things about adopting a scientific approach to training is that it tells us the best ways of managing and training our horses based on science and not just on what we believe to be true. Now here's a little bit more about the horse. Horses aren't great at thinking or working stuff out and understanding, but they're really good at forming habits and remembering, running away from stuff and making friends with other horses. Sometimes I think we like to think about the horse as like a bit of a silly human but in a furry suit, but he's not. He's really completely different, and he's absolutely beautifully adapted for his evolutionary niche. So there's a few things in which horses really differ from people in the way that they approach the world, and one of those is his memory. So the horse's memory is way more about real estate than it is about recollecting fun and pleasant experiences like ours are. So your horse doesn't travel home from a show thinking, oh, I wish I could have taken jump 5 a little bit better. But if you take them back to the showground years later, they will remember the terrible, scary rubbish bin that was in the far corner. This is because your horse's memory is all about survival. Horses form almost like mental maps of the areas that they have been in, and so unfamiliar things in familiar places cause great suspicion to horses. Their brains are all about real estate. So I always say to my university students, if they've got their own horse, you know, try parking something that's really, really familiar to your horse, like say for instance the wheelbarrow, in a place where he's never seen the wheelbarrow, say for instance the middle of the arena, and see what happens. And generally what you'll see is that even the quietest horses are at least intensely curious, and the more reactive horse will be actually quite terrified by this wheelbarrow. And that's because horse memory not only is about that, it's also about context. It's about seeing things in familiar places. And if you think about the horse's evolution and how he evolved, then you can sort of understand how that is true. You know, the shadow that wasn't there yesterday could be the shadow of a lion, and so he just runs away. And of course, his best trick is his speed. His one answer to all the problems that face him in his world is run away. And so when he sees something unfamiliar in a familiar place, he runs away. And that's why his memory is completely different to ours. And another way that science tells us that the horse's brain is different to ours is with a thing we call the mirror test. Now, a really interesting guy developed this test many years ago, probably 2 decades ago, in the time when universities were very interested in discovering whether or not, you know, how different animals were and animal consciousness and all that sort of thing. And so they developed a test for animal consciousness. And basically what happens is this: an animal is exposed to a mirror, and then the mirror is taken away, and sometimes the animal is given an anaesthetic and sometimes not. But when the mirror is taken away, the animal is marked with 2 dye spots, one that it can see really easily and one that it can't. And then the mirror is returned to the animal again. And so animals, higher primates like gorillas and orangutans, and large aquatic mammals like whales and dolphins, when they wake up from the anaesthetic and they see themselves in the mirror with a dye spot on their side or on their face, show great surprise and interest at the dye spot. And animals like the horse and cats and even human toddlers under the age of 2 show absolutely no surprise at all when they see the dye on their face in the mirror. And we take it from that experiment to understand that the horse doesn't really see himself as a separate entity. He doesn't understand that when he's looking at himself in a mirror, what he sees is himself. And for those of us trying to work out, you know, how our horses think, I usually start at that point and say to people, you know, when you don't understand that what you see in a mirror is yourself, how can we possibly get an understanding of what life is like for the horse? It's really completely different to ours. The other aspect of the horse's brain, which is really interesting to us as trainers, is that the horse does not have what we call object permanence. That means when he can't see something, as far as he's concerned, it's gone away. Now, when we were all small, our parents probably played a game with us that I always call the boo game, and we always play it with toddlers, where you put your hands over your face and you take your hands away suddenly and say boo. And human toddlers find this game really, really funny. It's because they are learning that when things go away, it doesn't mean that they've always gone forever. Well, you can't play the boo game with a horse, because when you go away, the horse, as far as the horse is concerned, you've gone forever. And so for us as trainers, when we train the horse, it's really interesting to remember that object permanence and that the fact that the horse doesn't demonstrate object permanence, because it means that when he can't see something, as far as he's concerned, that object has gone away. And so this informs really a lot of the practices that we do when we're training, such as float loading and show jump training of horses, because if we turn the horse away from the object he doesn't want to look at or doesn't want to go towards, then as far as he's concerned, that's a really worthwhile thing. And he can't see it. So when the float goes away, float's gone, you know, when he can't see the float's gone away. When he turns away from the jump's gone away. And so we have to understand that for the horse it's very important in training to keep his eyes on the object that he doesn't like. The other thing that horses are really good at is forming habits. And now they're really, really good at habits because of all the large grazing mammals. They are adapted to eat the lowest protein grasses. So they have a very low protein diet and therefore not a lot of protein to run a large brain. And as we know, that's what it takes. So the largest brains in the animal kingdom usually are driven by a sort of high protein diet. And the horse forms habits because habits are a lot easier than cognitive processing. So, you know, complex stuff like thought and reason and logic is expensive to run in terms of protein and energy. And the horse doesn't have that. And it also takes up a lot of space in the brain. And the horse's brain, which we know is the size of about a large mandarin, and most of that space is taken up with the really complex cognitive task of propelling, 500 kilos at 60 kilometres an hour over uneven terrain. So the horse really doesn't have a lot of space in his brain for complex thought. So therefore he doesn't do it. So he forms habits instead. And those habits allow him instant reactions from danger, to run away from danger instantly. Because, if it was humans, by the time we've thought about it, talked about it, written a book about it, made a committee and voted on it, we'd be eaten by the lion. Whereas the horse is over the back of the horizon and long gone before the lion can get him. And that's why habit formation is really useful to the horse. The other thing that is really interesting that science tells us about the horse is that horses can't learn by observation. So no scientific study has been able to show that they do. And it's a really sort of in a good way in some ways and not so good in others, because if it was horses could learn by observation, we could all just, take our horses along and watch Grand Prix dressage horses or show jumpers, and pretty soon we'd all have one. But unfortunately it doesn't really work that simply. But it also means that they don't learn to do things like windsucking and weaving, which when I was growing up we called stereotyping, we called stable vices, but now we know are actually a sort of a glitch in the horse's wiring. We call them stereotypies. So stereotypies, windsucking, weaving, box walking and those sorts of things are actually caused by the horse's sort of a frustrated part of the horse's behavioural repertoire, an inability to perform what he needs to do by virtue of his evolution. And so rather than thinking of them as vices or incorrect behaviours that the horse performs, we need to see those stereotypies for what they are, which is as evidence that our management is not up to the horse's behavioural needs. And so so that's a really interesting thing to know about stereotypies, and what we know about stereotypies is that the horse can't learn them by watching other horses do them, which is what we thought for years and years and years. But however, what can happen is that if we have one horse in a herd that exhibits stereotypies such as weaving or windsucking, then it can be very distressing for the other horses because it's a distressed sort of behaviour. But also the management system that produced one windsucker will inevitably produce another because of the gaps in what the horse needs to do. So that's a little bit about stereotypies. Now, really interesting and important for us as horse trainers to understand what the horse's view of the world is like. because their view is completely different to ours. Horses have got two different kinds of vision. That's monocular vision and binocular vision. And their eyes are on this very big eyes on the sides of their heads, which makes them really hard to sneak up on. They can see far away things better than people can, but they don't see colour nearly as well as we do. So horses and dogs are called dichromates because they've got two different kinds of colour receptors in their eyes. Although they can see colours, they don't see as many as we do. So horse colour vision is a little bit like looking at the world through a greeny grey filter, or a little bit like dog colour vision. And humans and cats are trichromates, so they have three different kinds of colour receptive cells in their eyes. And interestingly enough, birds have four, so they have a completely different colour palette to ours, and they actually see ultraviolet light as well. Cats don't see the same depth of colour that we do. Their world is more sort of gently pastel coloured. But horses have two different kinds of vision. They have monocular vision and binocular vision. So when they're relaxed and when they're grazing or just hanging out with their friends, they use monocular vision, and each eye looks around separately. Using monocular vision, they can see in an almost full circle with blind spots just in front and just behind them. That's why people say you should never walk up on a horse from directly behind them, because he might not be able to see you and could get frightened when you come out of his blind spot. They've also got a blind spot, as you can see in the picture, they've also got a blind spot directly in front of them. And that's just in front of their noses. So when horses focus on something, they use their binocular vision, and both eyes look at the same thing. So horses see down the length of their noses, so they'll often lift their heads when they're using binocular vision. And you quite often see them when they're frightened by something in the distance. They bob their heads up and down. And it's because they have a very thin strip of light-sensitive cells at the back of their retina, and they're aiming to get as much of the visual picture across that thin strip as they can. And that's why it's really important for horses to be able to lift their heads when jumping. They may not be able to see the fence if their head is lowered or at an unnatural angle. And this year we've been doing some research with my boss from university, and we've basically been putting a little camera on horses' heads and trying to work out what the horse sees when he's jumping the fence. And we've been very lucky to be able to use some high-level event horses, and we've tried to correlate where the vision is by holding a scary thing directly in front of them and shaking it, and then adjusting the camera so that the light from the camera falls directly onto the scary thing. And what we've discovered is that even amongst similar types of horses, so all three of the horses that we've used are high-level event horses that are all thoroughbreds, even amongst those three horses, there's a huge variation in where the horse has to hold his head in order to see an object, 2 to 6 metres in front of him. And some horses need to hold their heads up really, really high to see clearly down the length of their nose, and other horses don't need to hold their heads up nearly as high. And so it becomes very much that we must understand that it's the individual variations in conformation and eye placement that allow the horse to his vision, and it shouldn't be dictated by some sort of norms of, the horse has to have his head in a certain position. We really need to let the horse have his head up in order to see the best. Horses can't see below their nose, and that's why they've got so many whiskers. Now those whiskers are not really actually whiskers, they're called vibrissae, and they're incredibly important, and they're very sensitive nerve fibres that run from the end of the vibrissae right up into the horse's brain. And now in rats also have vibrissae, and many large mammals have vibrissae, or large and small mammals have vibrissae, and when they do autopsies on rats, the vibrissae in the brain end up in the same exact pattern that they are on the rat's face, and I assume that something similar like that occurs in horses. And so we can see that they're so important of the information that they gather that without them, the horse would not be able to, he's basically like eating blind, or it's like you've taken away one of his large senses, because he can't see what he's eating. And of all the ungulate species, the horse is the most discriminatory grazer of all. So sheep tend to eat just like a mowing, like a lawnmower, and horses have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and they can really pick and choose amongst the different plants that they graze on, and they have as much dexterity with their mouths as a human hand with only 4 fingers. So they really need those vibrissae to tell what it is that they are eating. And of course this becomes incredibly important to the horse because he can't vomit, so he can't risk, of course, eating off food or poisonous plants or anything like that, and that's why his vibrissae are really important. They're a big part of basically what the horse's sight is like. So the horse is definitely not colourblind, but his world is way less colourful than ours, and it's a little bit like looking through a pair of green glasses. And if you can see on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide are our horse vision goggles, and we make those to teach our pony club children that we teach what it is like to look through life as a horse. And so we've got a little bit of green. You can make these yourself at home, and they're fantastically good fun if you can get to do little jumping courses and things on your own feet. A little bit of green cellophane and then taping above and below so that you just leave a thin strip through which to have a look, and that replicates the horse's thin strip of light-sensitive cells. And you can do that yourself at home without making the glasses, just by putting one hand above your eyes and one hand below your eyes and looking out through a little slot about 1.5 centimetres wide. And if you have a look up and down and try and change the position of your head, you'll see how that is a very different kind of vision to ours and how that impacts upon the way you look at and see the world. So the horse is very different in many ways. His mind is different, his sense of smell is different, and his hearing is very different. We have a big prefrontal cortex in our brain, and it's the part of our brain that's responsible for emotions and planning. Now, your horse doesn't have this part of his brain. When you're hungry or thirsty at school or work, it's your prefrontal cortex that stops you eating your eraser or leaning over and grabbing your neighbour's lunch out of their desk, or just walking out of the classroom and going to the canteen and stealing food out of the fridge. That's your prefrontal cortex. It tells you what is correct in a social setting. Now, your horse doesn't have that part of his brain, which is why he seems to do things that are a little bit silly sometimes. But it's not really silly, it's just because he's not set up like we are. Your horse's sense of hearing is a lot better than ours. His ears can of course move almost 180 degrees. They're really in a lot of ways like little furry satellite dishes, able to catch sounds from all around him. And obviously that's another aspect of his physiology that makes him extremely difficult to sneak up on. And his hearing is so much better than ours that it's worthwhile remembering when you're at a show or travelling your horse in a float or in the stable with the radio turned on, that what we think of as background noise may actually be really offensive to the horse with his super sensitive sense of hearing. And the horse's sense of smell is about 1,000 times better than ours. And of course it's designed to help him evade predators, but it's also because he can't vomit, so it's really important for him to not eat bad food. And the horse's sense of smell may be 1,000 times better than ours, and a dog's is infinitely better than that again. So a dog can tell the difference between an Olympic-sized swimming pool body of water with a teaspoon of sugar in it and the same body of water without a teaspoon of sugar in it. So I can only imagine that the horse must smell amazingly different to a horse, and he must be able to smell a lot of things about us. So when we're looking at this picture on the left-hand side of the slide, that horse is in what we call doing a flamen posture. And the flamen posture allows the horse to trap scent molecules inside his nose so that he can hold them inside his nasal cavity for a little bit longer so he can work out what he's smelling. Okay, so the flight response. The flight response is the horse's instinct to run away from danger, and it's a really important part of his makeup. There are few animals on the planet as fast as a galloping horse, and their senses are very sharp so they can hear, see, smell and danger approaching. The instinct to run away is called the flight response, and it influences a great deal of the horse's behaviour. So really importantly, anyone who trains or rides a horse should understand how the flight response works, because managing it is the best way to keep yourself safe and your horse happy. Scientists call the part of the brain that sorts out what is scary and what is not the amygdala. Of all the large domesticated mammals, the horse has the biggest amygdala, and in a way this is what drives the flight response. the more the horse expresses the flight response, the more inclined he is to do it again. It's like a snowball. It starts small, but it gets bigger and bigger as it goes along. For domestic horses that don't need to run away to survive, the flight response isn't a good thing at all, especially during training. Long-term flight response can lead to what scientists call hypervigilance. That is when the horse is always alert and can't seem to relax at all. Horses that are expressing the flight response under saddle will try to go faster at every opportunity. They won't maintain a steady rhythm. They're tight through their bodies and they often carry their heads unnaturally high, and they might buck shy or launch into the air. So we used to think when I was a kid that the jumping horses that rushed their obstacles just loved to jump. But now we know that speeding up is just one way that the flight response shows up under saddle. And a horse that takes off on the cross-country course is expressing the flight response just as clearly as one that's running away from a hungry lion. So when jumping horses are well trained, they shouldn't speed up or slow down at their fences. They should keep the same rhythm in the approach and after the fence as well. So I like to think of the flight response as a little bit like a red sock in a load of whitewashing. Even just a little bit can affect the whole horse and not at all in a positive way. So the flight response includes things like bucking, bolting, shying, leaping, quickening, rushing jumps, tension, taking off, launching and spinning. So what do all these behaviours have in common? The horse's legs move quickly. And so how do we control that? By training really good responses both in hand and under saddle. That's why clear training is one of the most important things for your horse's welfare. The equine herd. So horses are really good at making connections and friends with other horses because that's what keeps him safe in his herd. We used to think that the herd was just like the ranks in an army with one horse at the top and all the other horses spread out below him, but it's much more complicated and dynamic than that. So the horse that is dominant at the waterhole may not be dominant when it comes time to get access to the stallion, and the horse that is dominant at the rolling wallow may not be dominant at food time. And so the leadership of the herd changes constantly. And so any training method that is based on the idea that there's a dominant horse and less dominant horses is really flawed and has been enormously problematic because it often invites people to be way more aggressive in the way that they train. We've seen that very clearly in the dog training world, and all good dog trainers now have really rejected the whole notion of the dominance and submission hierarchy because it's much kinder just to base your training on science and not on sort of hypothetical herd structure. So horses communicate with other horses with their tails, their forelegs, their long mobile ears, their large movable nostrils, their long flexible necks and the big eyes that they've got on the sides of their heads. And humans have none of those things. And so to assume that humans could be seen by the horse to be part of the herd is really counter sort of intuitive because the human can't communicate in any way that the horse communicates. They can form attachments to us, but they don't see us as part of their herds. When people try to use the ways that horses communicate with each other to try and train them, they generally focus on things like chasing. And scientific studies have shown that most people cannot see the behaviours that horses have between each other in a herd unless those behaviours are videoed and replayed back in slow motion. So their communication is so subtle that it's really difficult to see with the naked eye. But they, of course, are adapted to see it, so they're communicating. So that's why it's really important not to think of yourself as another horse or to think that the horse is, using us as a model of communication. So just a flick of an ear, the twitch of a nostril or the raising of a tail can mean something to another horse. Training based on herd dynamics tends to focus on chasing, and obviously because people have short necks, short noses, ears that don't move and no tails, misses out on all the other really important stuff. So I think of it as a little bit like going to a foreign country and trying to communicate using just swear words. So the bonds or friendships that are shared by horses in herds are often extremely important. In the wild, a horse on its own is really likely to get eaten by a predator, so making and keeping friends is vital. Bonding is so important that horses have a small patch of skin at the base of their necks just below the wither that when scratched and rubbed will calm them if they're excited. Because a horse can't reach this spot on his own, it has to be scratched by another horse, and this mutual grooming deepens the attachment between herd members. So before you start any training program with your horse, you need to scratch your horse at the base of his neck, and you might have to keep going for a few minutes to find the right spot. But eventually he'll relax and show signs that he's enjoying it. And that little place can be so easily reached when you're riding or when you're doing groundwork with a horse, and can become a really big part of the way that you can reward him for doing the correct behaviour. So just before I finish up today, I'll very quickly go through what we call the foundation responses. And these are the foundation of all the horses' training. And they include stopping, which includes slowing down and shortening, going forwards, which includes includes lengthening and quickening as the horse's training progresses, turning the shoulders to the right, turning the shoulders to the left, turning the hindquarters to the right, turning the hindquarters to the left. And these are all trained using operant conditioning. And there are lots of other tools in the horse trainer's toolkit, and these include shaping, habituation and classical conditioning. And we're going to have a look at those in the next of our webinars that we do with Horse SA. But for now, we'll just leave that there, and we can look at those next week or the week after next. So many thanks to Horse SA, not just for hosting this webinar, but also for their ongoing support of equestrian endeavour in Australia. And for more information about the book Horses Hate Surprise Parties, to purchase a copy or to download the slides for this presentation, you can go to www.sustainableequitation.com.au.